Hello and welcome to the Django ORM Mastery course, Level 1. In this tutorial, we learn how to output SQL code associated to a Django query. When working with data in our Django application, Django provides a database abstraction API, and we use this API to create, retrieve, update, or delete data in our database. The actual database requires SQL code to perform operations. And what's happening here is that when we use the Django API, it converts our requests into SQL code, thus being able to then correctly make changes on the database. So in this tutorial, we'll learn how to actually view the code that's being generated behind the scenes to actually perform the queries that we are generating through the Django Database Abstraction API. If you find anything in this tutorial where I'm referring back to different tutorials, this tutorial is part of the Django Database ORM Mastery course. You will find the YouTube edition playlist in the video description so you can view from the very beginning. If you would prefer a more comprehensive step-by-step ad-free approach, then you can definitely check out our Udemy course, Django Database ORM Mastery. There is a link again in the video description, which will always give you the best price for this course. The actual course thumbnail may change over time, so just look for the name Database ORM Mastery, created by Very Academy. Okay, so that may not have made any sense to you, so let's just break this down before we move into this tutorial. Now, a Django project, typically inside of a Django project, we have some code, and Django itself comes with a feature called the Object-relational mapper, ORM, and this enables us to interact with our database. So in Django, one of the benefits is that we can continue to write code with Python. We don't need to understand how Django interacts with the database. We just need to understand how to communicate with the ORM so that we can send it instructions for it to then convert those instructions into SQL code. So this is the code, this format, which the database can utilize to perform operations. So as a Django developer, we're treated to the fact that we can just continue utilizing Python throughout the whole project. And there's no need for us to necessarily understand this SQL language because the ORM will essentially convert our Python code into SQL code. So this example here, we have brand.objects.all. So that's Python code that we leave or include into our project code files. And then that gets pushed over to the ORM, and Django can then convert that into some sort of SQL code. So select all from, and then maybe the name of the table that we're trying to get data from. So this is an example of SQL code that then gets converted and then sent to the database. So in this tutorial, we're basically just we're just exploring the SQL that is generated from Django for us to be able to inspect it, and with the potential opportunity further along in our project for us to think about how we can potentially enhance or improve the performance of our queries through writing our own queries. Because what we need to remember here is that basic queries like this will get handled very well by the ORM, by Django, and converted into SQL. But once our project starts to scale, once we start to utilize more complex instructions, it could mean that the ORM doesn't necessarily create queries that optimizes performance for us. So it is handy to be able to view the queries that Django is creating before it is then sent to the database to be executed. So let's just very quickly move into our project folder structure here, if this looks unfamiliar to you. So we have this core folder here, which is the core Django folder. You can see we have these settings and we have an inventory application. Inside of here, we have the models, and you can go ahead and inspect these models. There's quite a few different models here you'll find in this file. If you move down to line 62 in the models, you'll see the brand table. And here you can see that we have 3 fields: brand ID, name, and nickname. And for this particular section, I have created a primary key, a manual primary key. Django normally creates a primary key for us, but I've gone ahead and created our own primary key here so that we can just perform some of the tasks in this section of the course. Now, I do also have the SQL extension to allow me to explore the SQLite database that we're using. So the SQLite extension, just type it here in the extension search bar. You should be able to then go ahead and download that if you're interested in that. That's going to allow us to right-click on the database, open up the database. Down here, you can see that I can then explore the database, right-click on a table, and then open the table to view the data that's currently stored in the table, which we have none in this case. So for the majority of this course, we're going to be interacting with Django through the command prompt. So Python 3, I will provide you or adapt the code into a view once we actually start looking into utilizing queries. But for now, we're just going to be utilizing the shell. So let's open up the Django shell here. So this is an interactive window, essentially kind of a Django wrapped around Django so that we can utilize a Django in the shell. So from here, let's go ahead and from inventory.models, let's import brand. And then, so we've imported the table. So we now have access to the brand table that I've just shown you. So we can go ahead now and just add something to the brand table. Now, this will be demonstrated to you and shown in more details how to create, update, delete data, of course, throughout the course. But for now, we're just going to go ahead, type in brand ID, because that was the first field, equals 1. And then we go for name equals, and then just a brand ID, a name. So let's just go for Nike. There we go. So that's going to then create a new object in the table, brand table. So if I now inspect my database again and refresh, I should have that now in the database. There we go. So in some ways, I'm trying to just demystify this abstraction from writing Python code here to then it being converted into a language which can then be read, understood by the database. And that's essentially what we've done there. We use a create statement, which we'll learn more about through the course, and that's been converted into SQL and then executed via the database. So let's take a look how to use this query attribute to then view the SQL data. So let's create a new variable x. So we're going to run brand, like we did in the diagram, brand.objects.all. So this is a command which we'll learn more about again in this series, where we can extract or we can collect all the data that's currently inside of this brand table. So .query. So we're going to use the .query here at the end, run that, and then we are going to need to print. If I just type in x here, we're just going to retrieve an object. So I do need to type in print and then x, and we can now see a representation of the SQL that's being generated to actually perform the request here that we've requested utilizing Python. So we are going to learn more about the SQL if you're not familiar to this, but essentially this is the language here that's being utilized. Select, it's identifying what we want to select from the table. You can see the fields that are being selected, and then we then determine where we want to select this data from, and that's the brand table. Okay, so if you head over to the Django documentation and you type in Queryset, and then just go over to the Queryset API reference. On the right-hand side here, you're going to view all the different methods or different tools that are available for us to utilize them to build queries to extract, return, add data to the database. If we look closely at the methods that we can apply in a query, there is a distinction here. Methods that return new query sets and methods that do not return query sets. And essentially the difference here is that methods that return query sets is essentially saying that these methods are utilized to collect data from a database and return something from the database. And down here, we can say loosely that these methods here do not return query sets, so they don't return any data. So here we're trying to maybe insert data or update data that exists already or we want to add to the database. So that's an important distinction, because what you're going to find is that we can't use .query if we are utilizing any of these functions here that do not return query sets. Because as I kind of alluded to here, this is an attribute of a query set. We can only use .query if we're returning a query set. So it just happens our previous query, we were using the all function here, and that of course returns a query set. So therefore we were able to use .filter. So let's just showcase how we can't use the query attribute on any of the functions, or if we use a function that is not returning a query set. So here I've gone ahead, I pressed up a few times and I found the previous command we were using, the create command. I've changed the brand. So I've just gone ahead and just changed the brand to ID2 because we already have ID1, and the name to Reebok. And then I run the .query attribute here at the end, and you'll notice that we then return, actual fact, a unique constraint failed here because I've already added this to the database. So if you do return unique constraint failed, it means potentially that data already exists in the database. So let me just try something else. Change that to 3. Now if I try this, we can see here it then returns brand object has no attribute query. So we can't return the query information like we did with a .all, or potentially using any of the other functions that are seen in this documentation here underneath the methods that return new query sets. So the last point I wanted to make here was that when we return SQL utilizing .query attribute, we need to remember that it isn't formatted in a way that we can simply just utilize to run the SQL in a raw format. So we couldn't utilize this code directly and send it to the database to perform operations because it's not formatted correctly at this point. So it does show a good representation of exactly what's happening, but what you're going to find here is the syntax is going to be incorrect. Django would utilize this to then help instruct it in what to do, then send these parameters over in the format that's corresponding to the database that you're currently using.